The dedicated schools grant, it's allocated according to the national funding formula, which is outdated and which puts schools such as mine in Gloucestershire under increased pressure. Mainstream schools in the lowest funded local authority receive £5,000 less per pupil per year than they do in the highest funded authority. My mainstream...
Honourable friend give way?
Yes, please.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. In Oxfordshire, we only receive a area cost adjustment of just 2%, so that's to take into account the difference in cost of living in different parts of the country. In London boroughs, it reaches 18%, and that's simply does not match the cost of living in Oxfordshire, where house prices are very much comparable to London. Does he share my concerns, therefore, that this lack of funding is impacting the education of our children?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. As somebody who was, let's be generous and say, barely educated in Oxfordshire himself, I'm very much aware of the issue. My mainstream schools in Gloucestershire fall into the bottom 20% of DSG funding, earning £1,000 less per pupil than schools in the top 20. This means, for example, that Cleeve School, with its 1,851 pupils, faces an approximate annual deficit of over £1.8 million compared with a similarly sized school, for example, in Middlesbrough. Please.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and agree with all of the points that he's making so far. This morning I spoke to the headmaster of Thomas Hardy School in Dorchester in my constituency. His previous job was at a London Borough School in Croydon, where he told me that on average he received £10,000 per pupil. In West Dorset that figure is £5,000. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the government's funding formula for schools does not take into account the added cost of rurality, the added cost of providing services in places like West Dorset and no doubt in his own constituency?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank my honourable friend from West Dorset, and with such gravity he says it better than I could ever hope to. Certainly the inequity is there for all to see, and it's interesting that one of his own teachers has experienced both ends of that scale. My own 4-year-old daughter and her friends will begin their primary school education in Gloucestershire in September. I want them to have, as Labour manifesto put it, the opportunities they deserve. To me, that means the same opportunities as every other child. But by the time they finish their GCSEs under this inequitable system, the dedicated schools grant will have invested between £10,000 and £50,000 less in our children than those elsewhere in the country. The government might point to an upward trend in the dedicated schools grant in Gloucestershire since 2021, but on the current trajectory, it will take 15 years to achieve equity. By then, my daughter and her friends will have long since left school. Unless the government acts now, their potential will have been diluted by the dedicated schools grant as is. By the time we achieve equity, according to trends based on the government's own statistics, the vast majority of those teaching today will have retired. My head teachers have told me that for most schools, approximately 85% of their funding is ring-fenced for staffing costs, but that rises to over 90% in some particularly desperate cases. The level of teaching experience in our schools is diminishing because our head teachers are having to make their most experienced and highly paid teachers redundant so that they can recruit less experienced teachers on lower wages just to balance the books.
Would the honourable member give way?
Yes, of course I will.
I thank you for giving way. In West Sussex, the deficit on our DSG grant at the moment is 130 million, and it will potentially double by next year. Yet, despite that, SEN provision, which is the main driver of that deficit, is deficient across the district. I have so many schools approaching me on this subject. Does he agree that we need not just to find some way of wiping out the deficit, but also removing the fundamental cause, which is ballooning costs of SEN provision?
I thank him, and he makes eloquent points. Clearly, the SEN crisis is exacerbating this to a significant degree, and I think what we are really looking for from the government is a long-term strategic plan to deal with this rather than just to push it down the line. Since 2014, mainstream schools are required to attribute the initial £6,000 of additional costs for SEND pupils from their own core budget. Owing to the inequity in the DSG, it's easy to see why this has a greater impact on those schools in lower funded authorities. Resources have become so stretched Many teaching assistants are only available to support pupils with the greatest SEND requirements. Underfunded primary and senior schools are taking drastic actions to balance the books. One primary school head that I spoke with spends his holidays in school completing the tasks of a caretaker that he can no longer afford to employ. Across Gloucestershire, there is nothing left to cut. Head teachers are overwhelmed and cannot afford to meet the costs of any pay rise which may arise from the government's negotiations with teaching unions. The impact of an unfunded pay rise, I have been told, would be ruinous.